it's Lucy Litch, and this is Tiny House Conversations. It's the Australian-based podcast where I interview experienced tiny houses, tiny builders, and adventurers in the tiny world so you can discover how to create, build, and transition into tiny life. Welcome back to Tiny House Conversations, and today I'm speaking with Ziski and Ryan, who are experienced tiny houses from New Zealand that built their home with no previous building experience. Yes, that's right, no experience. Their home has to be one of the most stunningly beautiful tiny homes I think I've ever seen. They're currently parked on land in Auckland and will be moving to the Raglan area very soon. This was such a great conversation, and I felt like I could have talked to Ryan and Ziski for hours. And in this episode, we talk about some of the struggles they experienced during their tiny build, how they created and designed their tiny house plans, their process to easily find 3 different spaces on luscious New Zealand land to park their tiny home, and why it's important to build a relationship with your landowner. We also touch on the current situation with tiny house regulations in New Zealand and what they wish they knew or listened to back when they started their tiny build, and lots more. So let's go chat with Ziski and Ryan. Hey, Ryan and Ziski, welcome to Tiny House Conversations, and thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, Lucy. Yeah, good to be here.
Absolute pleasure. So you guys live in a beautiful tiny home in Auckland, New Zealand, and I'd love if you're able to start by, taking us back to where your tiny house story started and, what really inspired you to build a tiny house together.
Yeah. Well, we sort of separately had the goal to live in a tiny house at some stage, and when we met, one of our first conversations was around tiny houses and different ideas that we each sort of had on tiny houses that we wanted to live in, which was, I guess, one of the very first vetting questions when we were both dating. So that was interesting right from the get-go. Living tiny was something that was a topic of conversation for us. And we both sort of had our own experiences living in our own sort of tiny houses previous to that, eh?
Yeah. So I lived in it was a converted pottery studio, and it was in the bottom of someone's garden. And I lived there for nearly 7 years. And that was a really good introduction to tiny house living. So that space is actually smaller than the house we're living in now. And I really loved that home and living there and getting used to living in a compact space. But I always sort of had ideas on how it could be done in a way that made it more sort of user-friendly, so more comfortable to live in, having the layout in a way that made more sense. So I felt like those years I was really taking notes on what worked and what didn't work. And then starting to see tiny houses on wheels popping up. And that was something that I'd never even considered before. So that was really kind of knowing that was an option made it a lot more achievable than needing to buy land first and then building a small house on that.
Yeah. And my sort of tiny home living background was when I was with the Navy. So I joined the Navy at 17 years old, and for about 8 years sort of travelled around on a frigate, and got used to living in a very small cabin with 15 other people. So learning how to live in a confined space, and obviously you have a finite amount of things that you can have when you're doing that. And much like Ziski, the house that we're living at the moment has so much more space than than I had during that time. So living tiny was, I think, a fairly easy thing for us to return to when we got underway with our build and eventually moved into it. It is a lifestyle that if you haven't experienced, it takes a little bit of time to adjust, but we found that all of the shifts that have come for us in living in a smaller space have been generally very, very positive ones.
Yeah. You were saying before that both the spaces that you previously lived in were smaller than your current tiny home. So what size is your home?
Yeah, so our tiny home is 9 meters long by 2.7 meters wide, and it is about 3.7 meters high. That's the stud height, is about 3.7 meters. It's a tiny house on wheels, so we have a triple axle trailer that is 9 meters by 2.7, and that sits around about 600 mil off the ground. So our overall height is around that sort of 4.2, 4.3 meters in total height when you include the trailer.
And the extra height definitely makes it feel a lot bigger. So a small space can obviously feel quite enclosed, but we've got a like a monopitch. So what's called monopitch roof, and not losing a lot of space with a sharply angled roof or having a lower ceiling. All of that helps it feel a lot more spacious and kind of open, and really helps with that kind of counteracting that boxed in feeling you can get in a small space.
Yeah, and with our we've got a single loft in our house, and when you sort of calculate the floor size of the downstairs plus the loft, we're at about 35 to 36 square meters.
Right, and you can stand up in your own loft, yeah?
Yeah, so we've got the last step of the staircase is a landing, so that goes the remaining length of the loft, so we can stand up next to the bed. But then we can also, the height of the loft is tall enough that we can sit up comfortably in bed, so like making the bed is easy, and kind of getting things from up there is actually quite straightforward.
Having a landing was sort of it was just a really important aspect. We wanted to be able to stand in the bedroom. So the at the high end of our mono-pitch ceiling, it's around about 1.7 meters
from the landing
to the ceiling. So it's just enough, maybe 175, which is just enough for me to stand.
And I can stand with my hands above my head. So we're very tall people, as you can tell.
That's so good, because I think sometimes a lot of the tiny house designs that I've seen, maybe that part can often be missed where having a loft, a lot of people seem to have they're not able to completely fully stand up, and you might not think about that in terms of when it's being built. Because I certainly didn't think about that initially until I heard some different people speaking about how they can stand up in their loft, or I've seen some videos online, and I'm like, oh yeah, that would actually be a really functional and practical thing to consider, because especially if you're going to be in it long term and, getting up and down and all of that it would be a lot more practical that way.
Yes, and I think that was a big thing for me. So in the previous tiny house I lived in, it was pretty much just crawl space upstairs, and that just felt really it felt tricky, to vacuum up there or anything like that, and I think we just wanted it to feel like you say, that kind of ability to live in it long term, that over an extended period of time, that we're not starting to do damage to our bodies, or as we age as well, we're going to want to be able to stand comfortably in that space. And I think those kind of considerations mean that it can be a long-term living arrangement.
Yeah, we can see and understand how people struggle with fitting a landing into their designs, because essentially you've got to compromise height in the area underneath the landing. But what we were able to do is make sure that our washing machine and some storage cupboards and whatnot were underneath that dropped down landing, so that whilst we were compromising height, it was in areas where you don't need a huge amount of height underneath the landing. And something that we actually practiced or checked out was having our toilet, we've got a separate dehydrating toilet, composting toilet underneath that landing. So even though the height of the ceiling in the bathroom underneath where the landing is only 1.2 meters or so, you actually only need 1.2 meters when you're sitting down on a toilet. So and with a separate, it's quite a long toilet, so you sit quite far out, and there's just no chance of hitting your head when you're standing up or sitting down onto that toilet. So we were able to sort of cleverly use the space underneath that compromised area within the bathroom.
Oh, perfect. That's a really good tip, actually. And speaking of composting toilets, what kind of setup do you guys have?
So we have a separate, which is kind of a glorified toilet. But so definitely more simple versions work just as well. And the aim of it is that it's a dehydrating toilet. So it has a small fan that constantly pulls air under the seat through the toilet and then vents it out the side of the house. And that means that it's really basically no odor toilet, which is fantastic in a small space. And then when the bucket gets emptied, Ryan does the emptying, and then it turns into human manure. So there's some really great resources around how to safely make human manure, and how to use that compost, ways that you can use it and ways that kind of aren't recommended in terms of putting it on. The recommendations are to put it on flowers or fruit trees, not something that you're going to directly eat. But yeah, then it just becomes, it's just kind of goes through its process in some barrels outside. And that's a really no odor type process as well. And it takes about a year for it to fully break down. But you notice a lot of decomposition already after about 6 months.
Yeah. So we've only been using it for a year now, and the first sort of loads of human manure are getting close to being ready to put onto a larger compost pile that we'll use purely for stone fruits and flowers and things like that.
Speaking of human manure, there is a really good resource just for everyone listening called the Human Manure Handbook, which I'm sure you guys have come across.
Yeah, we've got that on our shelf here.
Yeah, amazing. So I will actually link to that in the show notes if anyone is interested. And your tiny house is a DIY build, and I'm wondering what made you decide to take that option instead of hiring a building company, and even how long did the build take you?
Yeah, we really wanted to do the build. So I think we both sort of had that as one of our goals. I have a sort of a rolling bucket list, and on that is to build my own home. And Ziski wanted to do the build as well. So we could have had it done faster. It may have even cost similar, maybe less, maybe a bit more, to have someone else build it. But the process of building it was really important for us to be involved with.
Yeah, that connection with the house that we're going to be living in and taking on a really significant project and seeing it through. I think those are things that really appeal to us.
Yeah. Good test for a relationship. I tell you, if you can build a tiny house with your significant other, then you've got a solid relationship there. It's it was a really, really enjoyable process. But the other reason that we decided to do a DIY build is that we wanted to have sort of total control in what materials were used for every different area of the house. We had guiding values that kind of set the way that we were conducting the project. Around having a very low environmental impact, reusing and upcycling as many materials as possible. And that just simply wouldn't have been doable if we were outsourcing the build to someone else. It just would have been far too time consuming. So so for us to be doing the DIY build afforded us the opportunity to source materials that we wanted to use for the build that were in line with our value sets, the sort of the guiding principles for the build.
And having those principles to kind of return to when we were making decisions about, because there's always compromises in building a tiny house. You know, you're sort of thinking about what's important to you as well as what's kind of feasible within a budget, and then also what's practical in terms of the fact that it's going to have to be movable, it can't be too heavy. And so having those principles to return to when making those decisions meant that we were compromising in ways that still felt appropriate to us, or still felt kind of aligned with what we were trying to do. And overall, the build took us, so from when we got our trailer to when we moved in, took us about 13 months.
Yeah.
And we were both working full time. So we completed it over weekends and pretty much every evening after work. And we also had really very amazing friends, still have those friends, who came and donated their time and knowledge and would just come and, you know, keep us company or help with kind of heavy things that you need more than two people for. So we were really lucky with that, from friends and family who really chipped in and supported us.
Yeah, calling in the tribe to help out.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. And I love what you both shared about, you know, having, you know, these shared values and wanting to, I suppose, customize it in different ways that really align with your values and what you wanted to do. I know for me, it's also a really big non-negotiable, I would say, in terms of the types of materials, you know, non-toxic and eco-friendly, even to the point of the paint that's being used and light bulbs and all of that kind of stuff. So I think that's really, really cool. And, you know, 13 months is, especially doing it part-time, that's a really good effort. And I'm wondering as well, because I'm sure it's been such a learning experience. And Ryan, as you said before, you know, testing the relationship maybe at times too, and learning all sorts of new things about each other. I'm wondering, what was one of your biggest struggles during the building process? You know, were there many mistakes made, or, you know, what can you share about that?
Yeah. I think probably one of the biggest struggles with the build was managing our different expectations. So, you know, I'm very much I see success in terms of progress, and so for me, there were days when I didn't feel as though we were progressing enough, and naturally there's sort of frustration that comes with that, you know, feeling as though I wish we had have got to, you know, we had completed this job or got closer to completion of a particular area or something like that. And so that sort of expectation that we would progress a certain amount not being met would leave me feeling a bit disheartened. And I think, you know, when you're working with someone else, there's one of two ways that when one person's feeling frustrated, there's one of two ways that the other party can kind of go. And one of I think the way that that Ziski handled that was just so beautiful for our relationship, because she would help me to sort of understand that maybe moving forward we can look at each day in terms of what would success look like today, and we'd define that at the beginning of the day. And what would a bonus be if we could get, you know, if we were able to achieve that version of success, able to progress in that amount, what would a bonus be on top of that? And so I started looking at our progress very differently. It was much more manageable and bite-sized, rather than going, I want to get all of the internal lining done within the next couple of days, and then being disappointed when naturally you know, it'd take a little bit longer than expected. I think that was one of the big areas where it was different to what my expectations were, but where our relationship really grew around communication and dealing with my dissatisfaction of where we might have got to on any particular day.
And with a big project as well, sometimes the progress can be quite hard to identify because there's so many things that aren't done. And so actually taking the time to look at what has been done, I think that was quite helpful for us as well, kind of having these milestones that we'd celebrate, when we got the building paper on, it was still really cold. It was winter, I think. And we sat on just the subfloor on our trailer with the building wrap on and had pizza and a bottle of wine. And we were just like, this is amazing. We've gotten to this point. And actually just acknowledging it, because otherwise it can feel really, like you were saying, really disheartening because, well, the house still isn't finished, and that was a really helpful thing for us just to keep that motivation up for the year and a bit that we were building.
Yeah, so true. Yeah, and as far as mistakes being made, there were plenty of times where things didn't go quite to plan. I guess the way that I would, when things don't go to plan, my way of responding to that would be different to Ziski's way. My one would be sort of externalizing that and sort of swear words and throwing my hands up in the air and going, this is all a bit too hard. And Ziski's way would be probably going more internal and feeling, disappointed by whatever the disappointments were at that time. And there's plenty of examples of times where it didn't quite go right. But when you've got a really solid foundation that your relationship's built on, and you've got true understanding of how the other person operates at those times of stress or disappointment, and respecting the way that they do their process, it helps you to sort of be able to ride those waves. And it is a roller coaster. It's such a roller coaster doing a big project like this, but to know what to expect when you're in that dip, and there will be many, many dips and loops of that roller coaster, just knowing how you're going to operate between you when those things happen.
Yeah. And also some of the mistakes we made ended up now being some of the features of the house that we really like or that are really unique. So in the on our ceiling, it's made of SIP panels, which are structurally insulated panels, and they're aluminium on the outside, and then basically between that sandwiched is polystyrene. So there you don't need a like a roof cavity or an external like corrugated iron or anything like that on the roof. So they're really lightweight, they don't take up a lot of space, and we found them really good for tiny house building. But to attach them to our frame, we had to cut away some of the metal, and we ended up accidentally on 2 panels making that cut in the wrong place. And so we were umming and ahhing about what we wanted to do to sort of cover that. And we thought, do we put on a thin lining of plywood, or do we put like wallpaper over the inside of the roof? And we ended up covering the joins of the SIP panels and as well as the cuts that we'd made with some just little timber slats, and staining those dark, and then just made a pattern out of the in between those
the joins.
In between the joins. So it's become sort of almost like a panelled ceiling.
So we had an architect that was here just very briefly helping us, a French guy that was traveling around the country. He asked to come and help for a couple of days, and he gave us some really nice advice. He said, if you can't hide a feature, make a feature out of it. So we had made these big mistakes, essentially. Well, I say I had made these big mistakes on the ceiling where we didn't have aluminium for a strip, and he said try making a feature out of it. So we put up this beautiful sort of, not quite a lattice structure, but it's just these really nice roof ceiling details now. And we would make lots of mistakes. We would, a hammer would miss a nail or something like that. We kind of got to a point where we realized these things are going to happen, especially considering we're routing all of the grooves into all of our internal lining. all of the ply grooves were hand routed. So we got to a point that when we'd make a mistake, we'd yell out, "It's that's character, it's character. Don't worry, that's just a bit of character to the build." So we were kind of able to start making light of these small mistakes that were just bound to happen.
And like letting go of that expectation or idea of perfection, that it's like we're going to be able to create this perfect show home. I think that was really helpful. It made it more enjoyable.
I love all of that. You know what it sounds like to me? It's almost like your experience building your own tiny house. It's a reflection or a mirror for life in general, or, there's so many metaphors in there. It's like, taking things one step at a time and celebrating the small wins and turning mistakes into opportunities and, letting go of needing to be perfect and expectations and all of that. So that's really beautiful. And it sounds like it must have been such a growth experience as well in many ways, and something to be really proud of with your end result. How did you guys come up with your design and plans for your home? So did you buy existing plans or did you create them yourself?
So we made the plans ourselves, and we attended a workshop that was really, really helpful. That was run by somebody called Everett Norris in New Zealand. And there was an amazing Canadian builder called Ben Garrett who came and presented there. He really focuses on natural building materials. And when we started that weekend workshop, we were quite sure that we were going to be a 10-meter long tiny house. And there were a couple of different things, like we thought we were going to have timber framing. And kind of throughout the process of that, of the tiny house workshop, we ended up making significant changes. So we changed back and forth maybe 4 or 5 times before we settled on steel framing and reduced the length of our tiny house, which we're really glad we did. We didn't need a 10-meter long home. And that was just really, really helpful to talk with other people about their ideas and, have these experts talking about certain things to consider, like making your home weatherproof and that kind of thing. And so we had done our plans on paper and had looked at a whole bunch of different designs and watched videos and so on. And then Ryan made on SketchUp a 3D version of our house. And then we got a VR headset. So we were able to walk around inside the house and see how it actually works, and we ended up making changes from there as well, like certain things were at weird heights and that kind of thing. So we had a pretty good idea of what it would look like before we actually started building, which was really helpful.
Yeah, and there's so many resources on, for those that are coming into a DIY build that have no experience building, and that we were in that category. We hadn't built anything before, so it's not as though we came into this with all of the knowledge on how all of these different tools worked, let alone how you build a tiny house on a trailer.
Yeah.
We might have made a square meter standing garden at one point and a little bit of woodwork here and there, but seriously no building knowledge. There are so many resources, and would encourage anyone that's thinking about doing a DIY build to attend a tiny house workshop like we did, because you get a great amount of knowledge in a very condensed amount of time. That might be over a day or two or 3. You're able to get all of this knowledge to help you start making decisions, but also watching full, like a full series of anyone else building tiny houses. And on YouTube, there's one that we watched that was called Tiny Nest.
That was great.
And they had a really different kind of tiny house to what we've created here. But to watch their process just got our sort of gears turning, or the right gears in our brains turning. What sort of considerations do we have to make with all of these different decisions we're making? And to have watched someone else's process and how they've come to make their decisions was really helpful for us, and would recommend that to anyone else, and which is one of the reasons as well why we tried to share as much of our information as possible. Once we'd completed the build and throughout our build, we were trying to share as much of our process as possible, just so that we were kind of giving back to the community that had given so much information and knowledge to us.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's really helpful too. And I love what you guys have been posting on your social media pages, because I think there is something really inspiring for those that might be interested in this path of seeing it in action and knowing people that didn't actually have that experience to begin with. And because that can definitely be a barrier to entry, I think, for a lot of people. And then if the option of using a professional building company, which can often be more expensive, in some cases, I think, just seeing it all in action is really helpful and inspiring. So, thank you for what you're sharing out there as well.
Yeah, there's been a lot of generosity through that, through the tiny house community. It's quite a tight-knit group of people. But once we'd finished our design and we have our cost spreadsheets and all of that sort of stuff, we just made that publicly available. And I think there's quite a bit of that, people that are willing to sort of just make what they've done accessible to others.
With a tiny house build, thinking about the things that you can make and that you're prepared to put the time into making, and then the things that you'd really like to outsource is quite an important consideration as well. So of course we had an electrician and a plumber gas fitter come in to do that side of things. But also things like cabinetry and our staircase. We got that professionally made by a company called Variant Spaces. And that was really helpful because with things like that, with some of our walls don't line up completely and, there's sort of gaps and that kind of thing. But on that scale, it's fine and it doesn't matter. But with the cabinetry, if you've got things that don't line up, all of a sudden your drawers don't move very smoothly or your cupboards don't close. And knowing that we were getting that made to a really high standard was really, really helpful for us, because we like things like the staircase. It's obviously got to be weight bearing. It's got to hold up over time. And we want those cupboards in it to work really, really smoothly. So I imagine for some people who've maybe got a little bit more time or experience, doing things like the cabinetry could be a really fun challenge for them. But I think it was a bit outside our skill set. So even though we really wanted to do everything ourselves, sort of recognizing where our limitations are so that we could end up having a final product that was really usable and fit for us was quite important as well.
Yeah, and I guess investing your time and energy into, what wherever you're at or what you're most capable with versus something that can be done more efficiently or effectively by someone else. So that's really, really good. And I'm curious about how you guys found the parking space for your home.
Yeah, our process for finding the parking space. So we've found 2 parking spaces so far. One was for where we built the tiny house, and the other one is where we currently are at the moment. And we've just found a third. So we're going to be moving our tiny house in 4 months' time down to Raglan. The first 2 times that we found parking spaces, we used we kind of went about it in 3 different ways. We put flyers out into the areas that we wanted to be. So for both the building site, which ended up being in Forest Hill, it was right alongside the motorway, which was a good place to build a property because you can't out-noise the motorway. So when we're using tools and whatnot, that was a good position to be in. We put flyers out in that area. We also put onto all of the local community pages a copy of that flyer and a little story about who we were, what we stood for, what we were doing, a picture of our dogs, which was quite nice. People like animals, and a little picture of our 3D design for the tiny house. And And the third place that we looked was in New Zealand. We've got a website called landshare.nz, and there's people that have pieces of land that they would like to rent out to folks in caravans and tiny houses. So we went about it in those three ways. The other thing we did on Facebook, not only on the community pages, but there's also grazing pages. So for people that have large pieces of land and have paddocks and things like that they want to graze off with horses and cows and sheep, we also posted our flyer on those Facebook pages because if you think about it from their point of view, rather than getting maybe $50 to $100 per week for grazing that paddock, potentially they could be getting $100 to $200 per week for an extended period of time, all through the seasons, and they could potentially still graze a portion of that land as well. So contacting people that were looking to graze their land was quite good. And we would get phone calls from all of those different ways. We'd get phone calls off the flyers that we had dropped. We'd get phone calls from the phone calls and messages from the Facebook pages we were putting our information out onto, and we were getting replies on landshare.nz. And we would ask, if we found that a property wasn't quite suitable for us, would always ask, do you know anyone else in your area, any of your neighbours that are looking to make a little bit of passive income off their land? And that's actually how we found the current place that we are. That was not directly through the flyer drop that we got the phone call from, but it was from one of his friends that he knew lived up the road and wanted to make a little bit more money, a little bit more passive income from their land. So there's a few different ways that we got sort of leads on places to find the land.
And we found creating a relationship with the people that we'd rented the land from was really helpful, for it to be a connection instead of just a tenant landlord type situation. And that was definitely helpful in terms of needing to make small changes to the land for access for our tiny house, or being able to put in a driveway, that kind of thing. So sort of having that relationship with the landlords meant that they were a lot more kind of open to those sorts of changes. And I think kind of fits with the idea of tiny house living quite well, in terms of that connection to the community around you as well.
Yeah, that's really, really great to know. And because I think that a potential barrier for some people, thinking about if I don't know someone in my own life that has land that would be willing to share or rent out space, or if, they just don't know what options would be available for them. It seems to be one of the daunting things that can sometimes stop people from even starting on this path. So it's really good to know, those little ways that you guys had success and that you've actually, found 3 parking spaces in total. So that's really good. And I'm wondering if you don't mind sharing, because here in Australia, from what I've seen online, it seems to be maybe $100 to $150 a week to rent the space on a land, depending obviously what features are on the land, or maybe if someone's on the grid or off the grid. What is it like over there where you guys are? And, if you don't mind, maybe what you guys have paid for renting your parking spaces?
Yeah, it's very similar here. It's between $100 to $200, I'd say, is our sort of main range.
Particularly in Auckland, I think.
Yeah.
So Auckland, I think, can be a little bit more expensive even for tiny house parking than maybe some other areas of New Zealand, just because land availability and generally just, I guess, the cost of living.
Yeah. I mean, we have friends down in Wanaka who are paying, I think, somewhere between $50 and $100 for their piece of land, and they're right on the edge of a beautiful river. They've got an outlook of a one of the rivers in Wanaka, which is just wonderful. So it does change all throughout the country. We pay $200 per week for the land that we're currently on, and that is, well, it's kind of one because we've got everything we need here. Like there was a water tank that was separate to the main house at the front. We've got a separate power meter. We've got privacy. It's at the back of a piece of land, which it's not very, you can't really see it from the road unless you're looking for it. And it's got a huge amount of space. We've got probably 2,000 to 3,000 meters of space that we could use if we needed. And our dogs love having that amount of land to run on. So when the opportunity came up and we knew that we would be paying somewhere between $150 and $200 for this piece of land, we just decided to be very generous. We knew it was going to be 2 years. We decided to pay $200 just so that what we thought was fair and reasonable for the land, and it helped the landlords to see the value in us being here. And in return for that, they've been very flexible with different things. They've paid for portions of the driveway to be put in. They mowed all the grass down before we arrived. So it's similar by the sounds of things as far as value in Australia.
Yeah, perfect. And also just to acknowledge what you said before too, Ziski, about building that relationship with your landowner. I think that is super important. It really contributes to a more positive experience and a kind of mutually beneficial relationship where there is reciprocity, like what we see in nature itself. So that's really cool.
With tiny houses, it can sometimes be a little bit of a contentious topic, and people have maybe some stereotypes or some not so generous ideas of what people in tiny houses might be like. And I think having that chance to create a positive impression, and illustrate how we're responsible with our wastewater, for instance, and, the way that we live, that hopefully the acceptance of tiny houses more widely, that starts to be accepted by the general population and sort of hopefully becomes a really valid way of living, as opposed to, being seen as something, where maybe grey water is just discharged into the land without proper filtration or anything like that. To have the chance to demonstrate the values that a lot of tiny house people hold as well, I think is really helpful, so that then hopefully when we move on, another tiny house can have the spot here, and instead of our landlord being like, oh, thank God we're rid of those people.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. Kind of changing the perception of what tiny houses might be to some people. That's really good. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm also curious, so here in Australia, tiny houses on wheels are classed as caravans. And so the regulations are somewhat slightly different, I think, across the different states. And even at the local council level, there are some grey areas. I'm wondering what the situation is like with regulations for tiny houses in New Zealand, and have there been any challenges with that for yourself personally with your tiny home?
Yeah, there's lots of grey areas in New Zealand as well. All of the different councils interpret the sort of governmental building standards differently, and they have different rules on. And I've had different sort of cases that have been landmark cases for people that are living in tiny houses. Our Auckland council, when we talked with them early on about what we were building, their statement to us was, it sounds like you're building a caravan. It's on wheels. It's movable. As far as the New Zealand Transport Association is concerned, that would be classified as a vehicle, therefore it's a caravan. And we're lucky enough that there have been some good landmark cases over the past 2 years that have been won by tiny home dwelling people that have kind of set the scene for hopefully some policy change in the future. The issue we have is that there just aren't any standards. There's no code to build a tiny house to. And so even for those people that are really trying to toe the line, that are really trying to follow the rules, there's no rule book for them to follow. So there's a grey area. Every different council has a slightly different interpretation, and they would determine differently as to what is a tiny house, what is a caravan, what is a dwelling, and what consents are required for each of those. So we did a bit of a risk analysis. What were we willing to do with our build, and we decided to build the tiny house in line as much as possible with the standard building code. There's certain things which just aren't feasible with a tiny house to build within, to a code minimum. Certain things like, the way the stairs are set up and without having a handrail and tread heights and depths and things like that. But simple things like having the extractor fans in the proper place, having your electricity all signed off by a registered electrician, having the plumbing all and the gas all done with proper certificates for those. The insulation is all to standard. Just so that if we do get that knock on the door and a red letter one day with a notice to remedy from the council, that we've at least got a shot of doing that. And at the same time, I think it's becoming less and less likely that we're going to get that door knock. Like, it just seems like slowly but surely the council's becoming aware of tiny houses being a slightly different category to buildings. And as long as they are movable and on wheels, and as long as there aren't any case law to say otherwise, and that the current case law that we've got that have said, well, this person got away with it and they've got something very similar to us, they were considered a caravan. As long as that sort of stays the way it is, I think the grey area is there for us to use.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess as tiny homes, become more popular over the years, I'm hoping that there might be some more clarity around that. I don't know about regulation or anything, but I guess it'd be interesting to see what happens, because I think a lot of people are doing it under the radar as well, depending on what they built or where they are. And I guess it's let's see what happens in this space.
Yes. Where the tiny house movement is being legitimised in New Zealand through the New Zealand Tiny House Association, who's working alongside government and local councils, I think, to get some different determinations in place, so that there is something for tiny house builders to follow.
Yeah, I think they're doing the same with the Australian Tiny House Association too. So let's see what happens with all of that. So I'd love to know, what was the overall cost of your home?
So our tiny house cost, we're not certain, but it will be somewhere between 130 and 140,000 New Zealand dollars.
And that includes, so we didn't have any of the tools. So we bought a bunch of different tools that we needed for the build. And we also factored in the cost. So within that sum is our rent for the place that we were building the tiny house while we were living in a flat nearby. So that was obviously part of the build cost, and we wanted to include that so that we had a bit more of an accurate understanding of how much it actually cost us overall. But probably the house itself, if we hadn't had to buy the tools or factor in the land rent, would probably be around, do you think, about 120 to 130?
Yeah, 120 to 130,000. Yeah. And that was within an environment in New Zealand where material costs are fairly high. The cost for materials in New Zealand is high, just by virtue of where we are tucked down in the corner of the world here.
And I think also we were really specific about the types of materials that we were using. So I think creating a really similar home with different materials would have a significant price difference, because we were trying to find materials that had really low impacts and that didn't have off-gassing and that kind of thing. So that definitely increased the budget as well.
Your end product and what you've designed is really, really beautiful. So I'd say it's money well spent. And if you think about also the comparison between the cost of like a regular sized home now too.
In Auckland here, we have an average home price of, it'll be over $1 million now. It'll be $1.1 million, I'd say, fairly easily. We are living in like our dream tiny house for a tenth of the cost of the average home in Auckland. This is the deposit on on a normal home in New Zealand, but we are actually able to take this beautiful home with us as well. So there's that extra benefit. But for $120,000 to $140,000, we have a really highly spec'd home. We've got beautiful native timber wooden floors. We've got automatic lights and automatic blinds that are all voice controlled. We've got beautiful double glazing windows, which helps the environment inside be a lot nicer, even though there's so many of them. We've got wonderful cabinetry with native timbers in that. So the end product for that price is, I think fairly reasonable.
For sure.
And in a small space, I think you can maybe be a little bit more free about how much you're spending on materials. I don't think we would be able to build a regular kind of conventional home with these kinds of materials at all for it to be affordable. But in a small space, I think it sort of gives you the luxury of getting those high-end things, knowing that it's still going to be affordable-ish, I guess, in the long term.
Absolutely. And I'm curious as well, now that you guys have transitioned into this tiny way of living, I'm wondering what you might have stopped doing in your life now that you're there that you were doing before. Is there anything that tiny living has been able to help you transition out of?
Clothes. We probably don't wear clothes as much as we did when we were living in a place.
Love it.
True. I think in a lot of ways it's sort of just created a lot more like calm and peacefulness and just opportunity to relax, and there's more space actually for us to do the things that are important to us. And I think we were talking about how we drink a lot less and we watch a lot less crap online, because we're more likely to go outside or take the dogs for a walk or go to the beach or potter around in our garden than just kind of muck around inside, in the evenings. So I think it's changed our lifestyle quite a lot. We cook at home almost exclusively, which is really nice. So we were flatting before and we had really lovely flatmates. And at the same time, in a flat, you have one shelf and a fridge, whereas now we can kind of store food for the week and store leftovers and all of that.
Yeah.
Kind of slower pace, I think, because there's so much less to clean as well. We can clean our entire house. It can be a shambles and we can clean it completely in less than an hour.
Oh, easily. Yeah. If we decide that we want to really do a full house clean, an hour would be tops to do that. And so, when you have a larger home, you've got more things and you spend a lot of time kind of tending to those things end up owning you. Whereas when you have many fewer things, when we can't really buy anything new. And if we do, it's got to be well thought out, and often it's going to take the place of something else. So, if we're going to buy more clothes, we've got to decide which other clothes we're not needing, and what place they're going to take. And that's not, for want of more space. We don't need any more space to fit those other things just means that you don't kind of thoughtlessly acquire things.
Yeah, I love that. It sounds amazing. And also, looking back now, is there anything that you might do differently with your build, or any of the features in your home or anything like that?
I don't know.
We get asked it quite a bit. What would you do differently now that you've completed it? And there's very, very few things that we can kind of put our finger on as like, oh yeah, that was that was a mistake. We should have really done this. I think because we thought everything out so much before building, there's nothing major. One of the toughest sides of living in a small space with this many windows is the heat inside. So super easy to warm up a tiny home because it's a small space, but if you've got lots of windows, there's a lot of sun coming in, even with double glazed, low-E, argon-filled windows. There's still a lot of heat in here, and our automatic blinds do a lot to sort of like, they'll come down at the right times of day so that the sun doesn't come inside. But we'd probably have some sort of an external structure, maybe like a
pergola?
A pergola. A pergola out the front would be nice, so that through our main bifold doors, we don't get a lot of heat coming through there, or some sort of a shutter type setup to stop the sun from even hitting the back of a curtain. You can actually stop it from coming into the house entirely.
And I think those are things that we'll put into place once we're in our more permanent parking spot, the one that we're moving to next. But I think it's also a consideration with when you are looking for a parking spot for your tiny house. So we're in a really beautiful area. We really love our parking spot. And at the same time, it's predominantly fields and vineyards. So there's no shade around us really. And that means that even when the wind is blowing through the house, it's like quite a hot wind because it's picked up all of the heat from the land that it's been moving across. And in the spot that we're moving to, we're going to have some shade in the afternoon, particularly in summer. And that's going to make a really big difference because it means that the house just doesn't get to that really warm temperature, which means we'll be able to use our fan less, reduce our electricity consumption and so on. So that's definitely a consideration that we hadn't really thought about.
Yeah, it's important to really think about the passive solar design, or at least try to work some sort of passive solar design into a house, into a tiny house that you're building, and understanding which aspect your house is going to primarily be on, so that you can account for the fact that a tiny house, a small space, will heat up, even if you've got really good insulation on the outside, and we've got particular paint on the outside that's supposed to not allow so much heat to come through the materials, and we've got proper thermal breaks and everything like that, but it still heats up quite a bit. And we're looking forward to being under a bit of shade in the afternoons in Raglan.
I guess there's always going to be things that you don't necessarily realize or you weren't thinking about before until you actually move in, and then you experience and see, maybe we could have done this. But
yes.
That's life. It's always life. Yeah, perfect. And I'm also curious, is there anything that you guys wish you knew, back when you started on your tiny house journey, or when you started to build your tiny home, that you maybe have more awareness about now?
Well, we were warned, and we thought that we kind of dealt with this aspect, but we didn't really. That when you're building on a trailer that is, held up by jacks, that's still a pretty movable surface. So it's not like a normal foundation for a house that, has maybe been excavated, and that doesn't change a lot day to day. So our trailer, when we were building, was on quite a significant slope when we were building, and we didn't always take the time to level it at the beginning of each day. And that meant that when we attach the frame, sometimes some parts of our frame, like they will meet up, but they're out, by a mil or so. And then when you put the cladding on, that's out by a mil or so. And then, you should put the windows in, and in order for them to be sort of square with the frame, they're not square with the trailer, and so on. So it's those little things that can sort of almost compound the further you get into the process, that, if we had taken the time to really level it each day, and especially after heavy rain and that kind of thing, it would have possibly made those tasks down the line a little bit easier. But we were aware of it. I think we just didn't prioritize it.
Didn't heed the advice. Yeah. And timings, working. Yeah. Coming back to something we were talking about at the start, and with optimistic eyes, especially if you're using steel framing, steel framing goes up really quickly, and our steel framing came in 8 big sections plus a couple of sections for our loft and for a little mezzanine that we've got. It went up really, really quickly at the beginning. So we went from having a bare trailer on day one, and within 3 weeks, we had a subfloor, framing, and building wrap on it. And so it took shape within 3 weeks. And I remember at one point I said to Ziski, I think we're going to have this done within 3 months based on how we're going. And it was 13 months before we even moved in. and we're still, even now, a year after living in it. So this is a year after moving in. We're still, just sort of finishing things up in our own time. It's super livable how it is, but we're just chipping away at some of the final stuff. But, to think at the 3 week mark that I thought it might take 3 months is laughable now.
So maybe almost a reality check when you start actually getting down to the nitty gritty, and you begin the process, and you're like, oh, everything just takes so much longer than, it might seem like it would. So
yeah, exactly. Like even things like putting in the windows, we were like, well, we don't need to really make anything, we just put the window in. But sometimes it'd be like an entire day's work, and we would have like put in one window and like flashed it and been like, wow, that's a bigger process than we thought it was.
Yeah, wow. Okay, so as we wrap up the conversation today, guys, I would love to know if you guys have any exciting projects coming up this year, or if there's anything you wanted to share with our listeners to leave them with.
Yeah, we've got a few projects. So we have our Facebook page just to sort of share our information on, to share our process on, and it's called Our Tiny Project. That is now going to sort of transition into our move towards living a more sustainable lifestyle. So all of the changes that we're making, which started with building a tiny house, now sort of taking its next step into living off the land a lot more, trying to minimize our dependency on a larger system. We've got an electric car, and we're going to be going off the grid shortly. We'll be investing in solar panels, and so there'll be a process around figuring out what will be right for that, as well as building a little pod. So we're thinking about having a sort of second dwelling in which we can work from home and do some art and stuff like that. Are there any other projects that I've missed? There's a few on the
small list. And I guess the move to Raglan in itself is a little bit of a logistical project. The process of moving down there. But just that will hopefully open up new doors in this process, in terms of having the space to grow our food and and kind of move more into that lifestyle that we've been slowly
moving towards. We've both done the full-time work thing now, and it's been really good. It's afforded us the income to start investing in this way of life, but the intention now is that instead of working for an income to spend on food items and on rent and on petrol and things like that, we're going to start trying to create as much of that as possible and do the primary thing itself. So for us, the next stages are to be able to sustain the large majority of our food needs at home, growing the things ourselves and eating seasonally. Instead of buying petrol, we'll have a solar panel set up that will be enough to fuel a car, and also utilize the free electric car charging within the community. And instead of potentially in the future, instead of paying rent, hopefully being custodians of a piece of land, growing enough food for the family that owns the land so that we can live there for free, and slowly but surely decrease our dependency on having high incomes to sustain our lifestyle, and instead living a lifestyle that sustains us from a primary point of view, rather than having to pay to live that way.
I love that. It sounds like you've got some really exciting things coming up, and I love how you talked about being custodians of the land. I think that is something that is so aligned with this tiny house movement, especially people are moving their homes onto a piece of land, and, you know, just simplifying life, going back to basics, you know, reconnecting with the earth and lessening the impact, and just doing as much as we can to be those custodians and those stewards of the land. So that's really beautiful, and I can't wait to see all of that unfold for you. You know, will you be sharing some of that on your Facebook page and your Instagram page?
Yeah, we will. We'll be documenting that kind of as we go. And just sort of as we're learning as well, because I think the way we sort of shared our building journey was very much like, hey, we've learnt this thing, not necessarily like, hey, we're experts on this thing. And I think we want to really bring that same perspective into these next projects as well, that, you know, this is what we've learnt through, you know, undertaking this task. Because I guess just like we aren't builders, but we, you know, went through the process of building this house, we're also not, you know, professional gardeners or anything like that. So kind of taking a similar approach to trying to learn what we can, giving it a go, getting the trial and error type results, and sharing that, so that hopefully other people will feel that that's something that they can try as well, and, you know, and learn from that.
Absolutely. And I think about it also from a primal type perspective, where and you know, this ancestral wisdom and traditional wisdom that's been around for so long, that in many ways in our modern society we've lost. And, you know, building shelter and growing food and all of these types of things are innately within us. Like, we do have that capability. We've just kind of got a little bit lost along the way. So I find it really beautiful to be able to reconnect with those things and explore those things as part of this tiny house journey and lifestyle. So it's really beautiful to hear what you guys are doing.
We would agree with you 100%. There's a different kind of satisfaction that you get from being tired at the end of the day from doing something with your hands, you know, building a house or building a shelter or doing gardening. There's a type of satisfaction in the tiredness that you feel at the end of the day compared to the tiredness that you feel at the end of a day working within a corporate environment and being on a computer and, you know, interacting within that world. The immense amount of satisfaction we felt at the end of a day building a house is uncomparable to a lot of the sort of satisfaction we feel in other areas. It's different, and it's more whole.
Yeah, closer to our nature, for sure. So you mentioned before that you've got your Facebook page, Our Tiny Project, and that's on Instagram as well, yeah?
So the Facebook one is just called Our Tiny Project, and the Instagram one is at our_tiny_project.
Okay, perfect. And do you guys have a website as well, or just the social pages for now?
Just the social pages.
Okay, beautiful. Well, I will link everything in the show notes to your social pages, as well as, you know, other things that we've talked about in the show today, different resources so that people can find it if they want to. All of this will be listed in the show notes on tinyhouseconversations.com. Just want to say, Ziski and Ryan, thanks so much for being so generous with your time today and for sharing your stories, your experiences, and your wisdom with us.
Thank you so much, Lucy. It's been really, really lovely.
Absolutely my pleasure. And if you're listening to this episode, thanks so much for taking the time to hang out with us. If you want more Tiny House Conversations, I release new episodes every Thursday. So make sure you hit the subscribe button and you'll know exactly when the latest episode is live. And we'll see you in the next one. Hey, Tiny Lifers, thanks so much for listening. And before you go, one of the best ways to support this podcast is to share the love. That way I can keep bringing you more valuable tiny house conversations to help you on your own tiny journey. So make sure you head over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to this episode and leave a 5-star rating and review. Thanks so much in advance. I appreciate you and see you in the next session.